Hello, everybody. Welcome to Iron Culture, presented by the Mass Research Review. My name is Eric Trexler. It is 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday night. That means it's time for another live episode. I'm joined by the good Dr. Eric Helms. I want to thank everyone for their patience. If you got here on time, you did your job. Got here at 6:59 p.m. sharp Eastern Time. You may notice we started a few minutes late. There is some kind of mysterious infrastructure project happening in the neighborhood of Eric Helms. A lot of ominous heavy machinery. We don't know what they're building. We don't know what they're working on. It's really hard to say if what they're doing is building different types of armaments. We know New Zealand tends to be very aggressive. It's hard to say, but there is some massive top secret project causing all sorts of chaos and noise. So we had to reshuffle a little bit. So we get Helms in a more leisurely condition, a more relaxed, a different vibe for the show. So Helms, how are we doing tonight?
Well, I'm chilling now. I had to retreat to our bedroom, which is on the other side of the house from where the, like you said, ominous machinery is. And I am particularly concerned, even though I'm relaxed, chilling on my bed. You see our nice headboard here. But I'm particularly concerned because my wife is on the body corporate. You say, what's a body corporate? It's the New Zealand term for the Homeowners Association. So she volunteers her good time to know what's going on in our area. And either one of two things has happened, and both are disastrous. One, she is not being informed about what's going on in our apartment complex, condo complex, which would be a breach of really the duties of the rest of the body corporate, and especially the president. Or two, she's not communicating to me as a co-owner of our home and her spouse what is going on, which is a breach of our agreement as a married couple. And we're coming up on our 20th anniversary in January, and I don't know if we're going to make it if that's if that is what's actually going on in category 2.
Yeah, that's tough because you don't want to have a strained relationship with your homeowners association. You also don't want to have a strained relationship with your wife. And unfortunately, it looks like you're working with one or the other. And those are two of the most important relationships in your life. So I don't know what to hope for on your behalf, but I hope for a speedy resolution. I hope you get to the bottom of whoever's trying to sabotage you, and by extension, me. But it'll be okay. We'll work through it. Tonight, we have a monster episode, as always, and you are going to tell us a little bit about an article you have coming up in about a week when the new issue of the Mass Research Review drops. And folks, obviously, if you like what we're doing here with the show, this is only made possible by the blessings bestowed upon it by the Mass Research Review. So, of course, you can do the Tier 1 of show support, which is like, rate, subscribe, review. Tier 2, share it with a friend, show up live, contribute questions either live or through our portal at massresearchreview.com/ironculture. Tier 3, the Platinum membership Gold Star member, is to become a member of the Mass community. And you can learn more about that at massresearchreview.com. But Helms, you've got an article coming up about protein and the potential harms or potential health risks associated with high protein diets. And I'm going to do like a semi-interview here to get us started, just ask you a couple questions about it. But the first one that I think probably a lot of viewers are wondering and listeners are wondering is why? Why write this article knowing a couple things? First of all, the kind of orthodox perspective that is very pervasive in our space is this debate over the potential health ramifications or risks of a high protein diet is dead. You know, high protein diet, good, period. So that is unanimously accepted across almost all contexts. But I will acknowledge, I think most people in the evidence-based fitness space would say, unless you have like a pre-existing medical condition, there are medical conditions that do impact, how your body responds to higher protein intake. So I feel like people have enough nuance to layer that caveat, but this does seem like a fairly settled debate, so to speak, in the space. Number two, another reason I'm curious about your decision to take this on is Helms. This is one of those topics where I don't think it matters what the risk is. People are not going to go on super low protein diets in the fitness world. So, with that kind of background information contextualizing the question, why write this article at this point in time?
2 words: clickbait.
Boom. Yeah.
Boom.
Got to pay the bills.
But in all seriousness, that's right. In all seriousness, it actually is specifically for those reasons, because I think it gives us the opportunity to think a little more critically, which is often the Trojan horse of many of my articles. Either that or how to get incredibly jacked, or both at the same time. So I specifically chose this because I think in our silo, we do think this is a dead debate. But the reality is that there is a ever and faster revolving content. I'm going to call it merry-go-round, just because it exists in a circus or a carnival, something that is macabre and depressing at times, but also can be fun if you can detach yourself from the existential crisis that is content online. You're going to see something crop up about protein being harmful. I'd say these days, monthly. I could have said quarterly 5 years ago, and every few years if we were in the early stages of the social media kind of news cycle, if you will. But now it's constant. And this has actually not been a new phenomenon. If you go back 60 years, there are these intermittent periods where there is some type of panic or scare that makes some degree of penetration on the mainstream kind of awareness of nutrition. And now it's just all the time. Whether it was the quote-unquote China study, or whether it is something being promoted related to vegan diets, or whether it is a clinical concern, this is something that people are faced with intermittently. And while we ourselves in the fitness community, especially the more bodybuilding-oriented, body composition, kind of strength-focused community, we're typically not victim to this because it doesn't fit our bias. We are well aware of the research, and it's been something that's been debunked many times already. Your clients, your family members, and people who may rely on you for information, because I think a tremendous number of the cult, the Iron Culture listeners, as well as the mass subscribers, are in positions of being educators, not just seeking education from us. So I think these days, when people are especially good at crafting narratives and using mechanisms and sounding pseudoscientific, it's especially important not to just whack the mole and say, nope, that's false, trust me, because someone else is saying, no, here's true and here's why. So while we are still dealing with the bullshit asymmetry rule, which is that it takes tremendously more effort, time, and investment with people who don't even want to hear what you have to say, which we'll talk about later, to debunk something that is false than it is to just perpetuate a myth in the first place. I think just being able to understand what arguments are typically laid out as far as why is protein potentially harmful is really helpful. So I think most people would understand kind of the 4 specific claims that were addressed in this article and would go, yeah, I know that's false. But I think in a few cases they might be, but I can't really tell you why. I just know that the data has not shown that. And, we've talked about empiricism as well as rationalism and mechanisms versus outcome, which are closely related topics. One thing that I think people like you and I, Trex, that lean heavily on empiricism, if we don't have some of those fundamental physiological understandings, we can sometimes appear like we don't actually know what we're talking about. Like, I'm aware of 4 meta-analyses which say, bone losses aren't a thing from high-protein diets. But someone could come at you and say, I think those meta-analyses are bullshit because it's epidemiology. And how do you explain higher levels of calcium excretion that track linearly with higher protein diets? And here's a PubMed ID. And to someone else looking at that, even if they're reasonably well educated, but in an adjacent field, or not specifically in the philosophy of science, if you don't have an answer to that, you kind of look like the person who doesn't know what they're talking about. And you just got, actually and gotcha'd. So I think being able to explain or have a response like, oh, yes, no, it is true that calcium excretion does go up with protein intake. But here's why that is not necessarily indicative of decreases in bone mineral density. And I can walk you through that and also point you to an RCT with a couple hundred people over multiple years, or the equivalent of that for each one of these claims. And again, you're on the wrong side of the fence for the bullshit asymmetry principle that you're dealing with in that situation, but at least you can respond. And for those who are open to it, who want to do a deeper dive, they'll be able to see that. And that will also spread within our community, so we have more people who are able to combat these false claims.
Yeah, and that's a good point, is that, you mentioned being on the wrong side of that fence. But the other thing you mentioned there is people who are interested, who, if this is happening in kind of a public square, digitally speaking, you may find that when you are trying to counteract some of these untrue, biased BS claims, it takes different forms. Sometimes it's well-intentioned people who are just not up to date with the literature. Sometimes it's just total BS. But, you may be going back and forth with somebody who is fully entrenched. Their Instagram, you're talking to them on Instagram and their handle is low protein Joe, right? So it's like, you're not going to convince them, hey, actually, like, low protein diets aren't optimal for this case and that case. Like, they're dug in. They've literally built a persona around that belief. So you're not going to talk them into anything, nor should you really be all that interested in it, frankly. But that interaction for others who are viewing can inform all sorts of people who are not actively engaged in that conversation. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind there. But yeah, so you mentioned that there were 4 specific claims in your article. Do you want to go kind of give us a quick snapshot of what those are, and then maybe go into each one of them and kind of walk through this process of, here's the grain of truth if there is one, here's kind of the most legit kind of steel man argument you're going to see on behalf of this claim, but here's the real scoop.
And I'm glad you brought that last point up about steel manning. So yeah, this is big shout out to the original authors. This was an invited opinion paper, which is essentially taking the form of a targeted narrative review by French and colleagues. And it's titled "The Harms of High Protein Intake: Conjectured, Postulated, Claimed, and Presumed, but Shown?" ? And it came out a little bit earlier this year, not too long ago. And they basically looked through the last 60 years of claims. And I think a really important thing we have to acknowledge is sometimes we think of quote unquote bro science or pseudoscience or fake news, and we assume it is always coming from some influencer, some charlatan pseudoscientist, even as you guys discussed on Front Page Fitness, someone with a clinical doctorate, but not a PhD, who is willing to either reach beyond their expertise, if we're being charitable, or purposely obfuscate in bad faith. You don't know. And we're not going to make assumptions. But nonetheless, the reality is that actually many of these claims did start in the scientific research, and they were either over-extrapolated on, overextended, either by the authors themselves or the media or people who science communicated at that time. Sometimes we're talking 50, 40 years ago, and they kind of caught hold. And this is that problem where the first time something gets interpreted by the media or by a given population who's interested in it, or many times by the authors themselves, that becomes the prevailing narrative even after it has been disproven. And it's not like there's something that needs to be retracted. What I'm specifically talking about is just, hey, we looked at a mechanism and then we extrapolated beyond it and we made assumptions. A really kind of innocuous example of this in the hypertrophy realm is the idea that the short-term increases in growth hormone, as an example, post-exercise, are therefore causative of hypertrophy. And we saw this 10-year period where we were providing programming guidelines for hypertrophy based upon what would optimize growth hormone. So it's compound movements, sets of 10, 1 minute rest. And man, that's some hard training, and it will make you grow, but it's a correlatory thing, and we're also over extrapolating on what growth hormone does. So the 4 claims that French specifically called out is, do high protein diets cause kidney damage without prior kidney disease, so in a healthy population? Do high protein diets cause bone loss or increase the risk of fracture of bones? Do they cause or lead to type 2 diabetes or increase your risk of developing metabolic disease? And then finally, do high protein diets reduce longevity or increase mortality rates? Are they more likely to make you die earlier than you otherwise would have? And to go to your point about steelmanning the argument, something that I really like that they did was they stepped away from the mistake we often make in science interpretation of taking a binary assessment of this. Either we have the data or we don't. And also they did not conflate an absence of evidence for evidence of absence, which is something that is actually really important when we think about what we truly can and can't know in the philosophy of science. And that ultimately, and we talked about this in previous episodes, when we put forth a hypothesis, that's just where it starts. And then in our own data sets, we're trying to see if we can show that that hypothesis isn't wrong. And in a way that's truly saying, actually, it's the null that survives, this comparison. We don't see a difference statistically between these two outcomes. So therefore, we're going to continue to believe that the null is true, that the thing we manipulated made no difference. And then once we see repeatedly in a sufficient sample size, or if we don't have a sufficient sample size, a sufficient number of underpowered studies to the point where we think we have a large enough powered meta-science analysis of the same question, you know what? This is probably not purely due to variation or probability. We actually do think there is a difference between these two. So therefore, our hypothesis might graduate to becoming something like a model or eventually a theory. Like, gosh darn it, Newton was right. Every time I drop that apple, it hits the ground. I think we've got the theory of gravity going for us here. So they actually had 4 different categories, which they would rate each one of these, not just disproven or proven. It's either 1, the evidence strongly supports the existence of the alleged harm. And I'm not going to bury the lead. Good news, folks, is you are right. Your biases have been confirmed. None of these 4 do we have strong evidence for. The second category down is that the alleged harm has not been demonstrated, but there is actually some evidence suggesting the claim could be plausible. And that's a relatively low bar. I just want to put that out there. Just because a claim could be plausible, but hasn't yet been proven, it doesn't even mean that I necessarily think it's likely. It's just, if we're going to be responsible scientists and science communicators, I can't just reject it out of hand. If someone comes to me and says, high protein diets do X, I can't be like, that's bullshit, because I don't want it to be. I can go, well, we don't have any data to indicate that's the case, but it's plausible. We need more research.
Yeah.
The next category, which is where we're often at, in my opinion, in this realm of health and nutrition research, is that the alleged harm cannot be ruled out based upon the existing evidence, but the existing evidence suggests implausibility. And Trex, this is one we're going to talk about a lot later in this episode because of the limitations of what we can and can't know with our largest data sets and the way that nutrition operates in the real world, out in the wild, where people follow dietary patterns rather than isolating specific things. And we kind of have to ask ourselves, okay, well, if this was true about this nutrient, what would the world look like? And certain claims are really implausible, even though I can't show you with actual true causation level evidence, that's not the case. And then finally, where we sometimes get to, but not always, evidence seems sufficient to rule out the alleged harm for practical purposes. So there was a mixture across these last 3 categories for each one of these claims. And I think the Steelman case for each one of them, I can go through that next if you think we don't need any more context, and I can get to it a little bit.
Yeah, let's dive in.
Okay, cool. So the first one is one you actually covered a few issues ago, or maybe last volume, the idea of lifespan and mortality.
Yeah.
And I think this is an interesting one because it's based upon animal data, and specifically insect data, where if we see where you can actually experimentally manipulate protein intake and observe the entire lifespan of an insect, because they don't live very long. And indeed, when you restrict the protein intake of insects, they do live longer, And oh, wow, maybe we should do something with that. And in fact, that doesn't seem to hold up very well. The reason being is that in subsequent work in a better, but still far from perfect or even typically useful model to extrapolate to humans, a rodent model, it doesn't seem to hold up. And if anything, there might be a little bit of data indicating that energy restriction could extend lifespan in rodents. But even that data is pretty weak. And then when we think about the problems with extending not only energy restriction, but the far more speculative protein restriction to humans, obviously we're not doing great with energy restriction as a species at the moment, especially in the industrialized world, right?
Yeah, we don't specialize in it. That's true.
No, no, no. We seem far better at the opposite, right?
Right.
And if anything, there's reason to believe that it would actually backfire. And I think the related topic, not of just all-cause mortality and lifespan, is also health span, which is what you wrote about.
Yeah.
And the data actually pretty consistently shows that protein is either neutral or positively related to healthy aging. And, fall risk, sarcopenia, all of these things. Now, there's obviously some covariates. Typically, people who are eating a healthy diet that is high in protein tend to be more active. So healthy user bias is a thing here. But the data mostly shows that, in fact, if you look at people aging well, they're generally eating a higher protein diet, and there seems to be more consistent positive relationships with dairy, mostly vegetarian-based sources of protein, and then in some analyses, fish and other lean meats. And the data is still overall positive for total protein intake, and even in some cases, protein that we might, vilify more, like red meat or something like that. But it's very difficult to take a look at the longevity data and make this and square it, because there's no data in humans that is that is causational that can be shown either way. The correlational data actually shows the opposite. People tend to live longer or have healthier lifespan. And then our mechanistic understanding of what happens when you try to restrict protein intake, well, actually, sometimes that leads to a higher ad libitum overall energy intake. So it might even, backfire and hurt the thing that has a better chance of enhancing longevity. And that's protein leverage theory, which I think we've probably talked about before. And that's the idea, and actually a pretty consistent observation, that when you look at people free living, just consuming as much food as they want, they will typically, as one of the many things that influences how much they eat and when do they stop, they're going to reach a certain relatively low protein threshold, maybe around 1.1, 1.2 grams per kilogram, somewhere in that range. Certainly not what we would consider a high protein diet in our field, but definitely more than what would be considered protein restriction. So by trying to restrict your calories, you might inadvertently end up consuming by trying to restrict your protein, you might inadvertently end up ingesting more calories and kind of throwing the proverbial intended baby out with the bathwater. But there's no good data in either case to indicate that protein is associated with mortality in general. And the observational data that's most recent and that I think is highest quality indicates the opposite. So that one we are going to put in the box of, we can't disprove it, but it's pretty implausible.
Yeah. If I may, you mind if I jump in
Yes.
with a little extra context here? So I think there are likely to be some people, Helms, who say, hey, I'm not an all or nothing kind of person. If, some folks are saying out there protein restriction helps out insects, I've been doing my bodybuilding thing. I've been eating, 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein per day. I tell you what, I'll meet you halfway. Maybe in the interest of longevity, I'm going to drop from 2.2 to 1.6, 1.4, 1.2. It's really important to recognize, when we talk about protein restriction as an intervention to extend lifespan, we are talking about very aggressive, severe protein restriction. So, for example, in a paper that Speakman and colleagues wrote about kind of the feasibility, just even the possibility of what protein restriction would look like and what it would offer, they argued that reducing your protein intake from 20% of your energy, which is not an unusual protein intake for a human being, reducing it from 20% of your calories to 4%, which is, for all intents and purposes, a non-protein diet, would be estimated to increase lifespan by half as much as the typical caloric restriction intervention if we pretended that these effects actually translated from insects all the way to humans. And we have ample evidence to suggest that is not the case anyway. So, like, if you think you're going to dip your toes in the protein restriction water and maybe get a little residual benefit, no one is holding out hope for that who's actually read this literature. So it's really important to kind of emphasize, like, it's one thing to kind of throw a Hail Mary and say, hey, maybe this will work for me because it works for insects. But if you're going to dabble into, tiptoe into it, you have to realize you're not even doing the intervention. And then when you start thinking, well, if that's the intervention, what do I know will happen, right? And the answer is you are really going to lose a lot of muscle tissue. That is not going to be good for just your ability to be a robust, resilient person who will maintain their mobility and their independence later in life, who won't suffer severe injury from a little bump or bruise here and there, a fall that you would otherwise be able to manage. So it's really important to recognize with protein restriction, if you actually do the intervention with the level of severity it requires, you are knowingly walking in to sarcopenia, which is a health condition that we know shortens health spans. So it's like, it just frankly could not be a more inadvisable intervention to do by the book. And then if you're not doing it by the book, it really just makes no sense to even try to dabble in those waters and tiptoe your way into some kind of modified, modest approach to it. I think, the people who wrote this review paper, I think they did a really nice job being very objective, very deliberate with their wording, being by the book, but not being demonstrative in terms of like saying this is a fundamentally terrible idea. But I, as a dude on YouTube, will tell you this is a fundamentally terrible idea if you're interested in a long, healthy life. That's my two cents.
No, exactly. And I really love philosophically that they said, listen, we're not going to have the RCT that manipulates protein intake for someone's entire life. Right. There are some places where we do have that ability, though. And one of them is the claim that high protein diets lead to bone loss, Trex. And this one is actually one that I think has been relatively well disproven. And it did start and originate in the published research as to the speculation of why it'd be a problem. So I'm aware as maybe the early 90s, perhaps the late 80s, there was the observation that with increased protein intakes, there was a small but relatively consistent positive association with protein diet. So high protein diets leading to increased calcium excretion. And the idea here is that the overall solute load of the diet then needs to be processed by the kidneys, and that is causing issues. So, the sulfur-containing amino acids acidify the blood. I got ahead of myself. I was thinking of the liver, or the kidneys, rather. Wow, I'm killing it. So, erase everything that I said from your brain. We're starting over. Hard reset on Eric Helms and his mouth-to-brain connection.
And
so the idea... And go. All right. So the idea is that the sulfur-containing amino acids lead to higher acidity in the blood. Therefore, we have to balance that, being more basic. So we're going to pull calcium from bone. So we're seeing bone resorption in order to buffer the acid. And indeed, we see urinary calcium excretion reliably increasing when someone consumes a higher protein diet. And that mechanistic, indirect observation of a potential marker, I'll even say, of bone health, led to the hypothesis of, hey, higher protein diets could lead to calcium excretion and then bone loss. But I think it's really important to make a distinction between a direct rather than indirect marker of bone health, something like I don't know, bone mineral density, which we can actually measure with DEXA, or the actual occurrence of fractures, falls that result in actual fractures, right? So I would say the most convincing piece of data is actually a randomized controlled trial, 3 years long, that occurred in 2002, and it was done in community dwelling over 65-year-old individuals, healthy adult and women. So this is hundreds of people, and it's a 3-year randomized controlled trial. This is the type of thing where most of these RCTs are not possible in other fields of nutrition, but because of what they were specifically experimentally manipulating and looking at, they were able to get a kind of a cool insight here. So what they did not experimentally manipulate was protein. They were just looking at, okay, what are the ranges of protein consumed in this group? And then what we're going to experimentally manipulate is we're going to give some people a placebo, and we're going to give others calcium and vitamin D supplements. And then we're also going to have the control group. So you've got a double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial, and they're looking at the impact of calcium and vitamin D, but they're looking at the interaction of protein intake. And the really interesting thing they found was that in the community dwelling participants who had a higher protein diet, or rather just who were consuming calcium and vitamin D, there was a positive relationship with bone mineral density and protein intake. So when there is a sufficient amount of calcium and D in the diet that's been ensured by the supplement, now we're actually seeing that protein is positively associated with increasing bone mineral density. And you could maybe say, oh, well, hold on, what happened in those not receiving it? Well, in there was no significant relationship. There was nothing to be seen. But there was not a negative one, which is what we would need to see to claim that in any instance, a higher protein diet results in losses of bone mineral density. And this has been something that's not just shown in that paper. I just think it's probably one of the more convincing RCTs, being as long as it is, as well powered it is, and being, double-blind, placebo-controlled, and the findings they had. But if you look at all of the position stands and like meta reviews, so people reviewing systematic reviews and meta-analyses, if anything, the claim that is being made by these osteoporosis organizations is that a low protein diet, at least in elderly populations, creates more risk of fracture or bone loss, and it is something that you want to try to correct. If anything, we should be trying to get the message out to the elderly. For the reasons you just stated in the last segment, we probably want to get a higher protein intake confirmed there. But of course, calcium consumption is very important as well. So for this one, this is one of the ones that we can definitely lay to bed. We have the highest quality data on it and a tremendous amount of observational data. And we also just need to understand that an indirect marker may or may not, in different circumstances, be connected to the direct marker. So calcium excretion is not the highest quality gold standard evidence of whether or not you have low bone mineral density. Believe it or not, that would be an assessment of bone mineral density. And then we would also actually want to look at to what degree is a change in bone mineral density related to and potentially an increased risk factor for fracture risk. And we have a lot of data on this. And ever since basically the creation of DEXA scans, we've seen a much higher quality understanding of this. So that one also we can lay it to bed.
Yeah, so just out of curiosity, it's okay if you haven't brushed up on your bone physiology. This is kind of a detailed question out of left field, but it may solidify, semi-pun intended there, may solidify the understanding for people who are confronted with this claim. So the calcium that is appearing in the urine presumably is coming from bone. So what's happening in the bone that is essentially offsetting this loss of calcium? In other words, like if the bone is losing calcium, why isn't that actually materially impacting bone density? Do you happen to know off the top of your head?
I am not necessarily sure that the premise is true.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that is not something I am fully convinced of.
That's why I threw a big if in there.
That's right. So if you're consuming more protein and we see an increase in calcium excretion, it could be that you're not absorbing as much of your calcium into bone rather than actually excreting it from bone, which are two importantly different things. It's a reallocation of resources, but I would imagine from an evolutionary perspective that actually giving up calcium from bone is pretty low on the priority. It's pretty high on the priority list for the body before it starts doing that. And ultimately, I think when someone is consuming a higher protein diet, they are often also consuming more dietary calcium. I would be really interested in a tightly controlled experimental study where you're able to clamp calcium intake and increase dietary protein. And again, I'm not a bone expert. This may exist, but I don't think that's the case. And maybe that could create a scenario where you'd run into issues. But I think that's not a premise that I would necessarily take for granted. And I have not brushed up on my the source of that calcium excretion of where it's coming from.
Yeah, it's I mean, and I don't certainly wouldn't fault you for that, because I wouldn't have either, because I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, but we both tend to be fairly on the empiricist side of the spectrum there. And yeah, I think you and I both kind of work from a top-down approach. And personally, I mean, I'm very biased. I just stated my bias. But I personally view that empirical inclination for people in our field as not a sure sign, but sometimes a bit of an indicator of just experience, in the sense that our field is so prone to this notion of I'm going to cook up a story for you. And it begins with a mechanism and it ends with something that's either fantastic or terrible. And you can only go through that process so many times and have it just completely unravel when it comes to the actual outcome-based studies. You can only fall for that and get wrapped up in the narrative so many times before you say, okay, you know what? Let me stop you there. Before you tell me this big elaborate story based on urinary calcium, I'm going to go look at fractures and maybe take one step down and look at bone mineral density. I'm going to look at the outcome and the most proximal measurements that would actually be highly predictive of that outcome. And only after I verify those am I going to even meet you at this mechanistic level where we start to figure out why what we're observing is happening. But I think, frankly, Helms, it's one thing to say, through experience that some might call learned wisdom, I am going to just not put myself through this every single time and get pulled into every rabbit hole. But it's also it's just pragmatically speaking, there's only so many hours in the day, Helms. We're on episode 333 of the podcast here. And we've covered more than 6 topics, which means if you really want to, and as a practitioner, you have no choice. You have to develop conclusions. Some of them you feel stronger about than others, but you have to develop conclusions that actually address the needs of your clients. And you really shouldn't be getting into the biochemistry of every body process every time someone throws a claim your way. It's a much more pragmatic, practical, convenient, and time-efficient strategy, let alone is it, in my opinion, more logical to say, okay, you're telling me there's a problem and the problem manifests as the following outcome. Why don't we go look at the outcome-oriented research and work our way back to the mechanism rather than solidifying the mechanism and then assuming that the rest of this cascade occurs? So all that is to say, I may brush up on that out of curiosity, just getting back into some of that bone physiology, and but for all intents and purposes, frankly, it's really not that important, because, like you said, Helms, for this particular claim, this thing's dead.
Yeah, and I actually just pulled up a paper that specifically outlines. It's from '93. And it outlines how data from the 70s and 80s really reliably show this consistent increase in calcium excretion with higher protein diets. And they then talk about, hey, hold on though, in their implications, specifically basically what I said, that their postulation here And this is before the widespread application of DEXA. And they're still, they're thinking through this. Whether harm results will depend on the basic adequacy of dietary calcium. Simply put, the interaction that the efficiency of calcium conservation is influenced by the level of protein intake. At high calcium intakes, the effects of protein can be easily offset by improved absorption efficiency. However, at low calcium intakes, the degree of adjustment possible is usually not sufficient to compensate for the protein-induced calcium loss. And then they go on to talk about the ratio of calcium to protein in the diet. So at this point in the 90s, they had speculated at the point of saying, hey, hold on. We don't think, high protein diets are just bad. You just need to make sure that this nutrient interaction is taken care of. And that's basically why I bet if I looked at the 2002 hypothesis for Dawson and Hughes paper in those community dwellers, they'd say, well, maybe high protein is fine so long as they're getting a calcium supplement. Yeah. And what they actually found was high protein is good if you're getting a calcium supplement, but it's neutral if you're not.
Yeah.
So it just doesn't, there's no way to work through how could it be that the bone is the primary source where this calcium excretion is coming from, to your point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think especially with micronutrients, a lot of people really oversimplify what's going like it's gotten to the point I think everyone should aspire to have adequate intake of all their micronutrients. A very bold claim by me. I'm really pushing back against the orthodoxy here. But it's a no-brainer. Try to get the things you need. But I really don't I'm not all that interested in tracking micronutrient intake very deliberately and closely because it has so much to do, like in terms of what then, right? So it gets into your body based on the food labels you consumed, right? But there are so many things you can do in the pan that make the labeled amount of that micronutrient irrelevant. And then there are so many food combinations that can make what was on your label either an underestimate of the actual impact in your body or an overestimate of the actual impact in your body. And this is another, you've mentioned like even just the premise that different tissues can adjust the way that they turn over or conserve or release some of these micronutrients. So I just as an aside, I think the way people talk about micronutrients as if it's as simple as like you need, 3 micrograms of this, so get 3 micrograms of this, period. It's just a huge mistake. And I continue to be amazed by more and more papers that, I've seen papers recently where they're like, I forget exactly which micronutrient they were talking about, but it's a micronutrient that tends to be a little bit light in vegan diets. And I've seen this, I think, for at least a couple micronutrients where researchers say, these vegans aren't really eating enough of it. And yet when we test them for adequacy, they're fine. And it turns out there's some kind of adaptive ongoing adjustment where they're extracting more from their diet than we thought they would, or they are retaining more of it and not turning it over as much. But the moral of the story is we thought they would have inadequate values in the actual tissue we care about, and they do not. It's so much more complicated than calcium in urine. Looks like you don't have any bones left. A lot going on in there.
Yeah. The next claim I'll go through quickly because I really do want to talk about the recent Instagram controversy, which will extend from this.
Yes.
Is where you'll see where my brain fart came from, and that is the claim that high protein diets harm kidney function, because it has a really similar hypothesis, and it's attributed to an author by Brenner. The Brenner hypothesis, I think it goes back to the 80s, and it is that high protein diets produce higher solute loads, and that is primarily from increased urea production, and that's from the nitrogen that's present in protein, but also from just whatever the mineral content is in the specific food you're eating that is high in protein, and that varies by source. So that requires your kidney to increase its filtration rates, which you'll sometimes see as glomerular filtration rates if you're looking at a blood panel or if it's described. And hypothetically, that creates a strain on the kidneys, which results in eventual kidney damage and reduced function. And this is actually reasonably well established in animals. So you can look at rodent models and you can see that if you give very high protein diets to them, you see kidney hypertrophy. Then you start to see actually scarring in the kidneys when you dissect them and look at it. You see the development of chronic kidney disease, and it's all bad, right? However, the human data does not bear that out, importantly, in healthy individuals. And when we actually look at systematic reviews of controlled trials, we tend to see either neutral or slightly positive impacts on other markers of kidney function. And I say other markers because I think just like seeing an increase in calcium excretion, seeing an increase in kidney filtration rates, glomerular filtration rates, if you kind of started down the Brenner hypothesis rabbit hole, you might position that as just seeing that as an overall negative. But when you really think about this from a physiological perspective, is it necessarily a negative thing or a pathophysiological thing to see higher rates of kidney filtration? Not always a bad thing, right? And in fact, when you look at the more recent like opinion papers, like the German Nutrition Society in 2023, they did an umbrella review of 12 systematic reviews, 6 of which had meta-analyses, and they looked at the relationships between high protein diets and a bunch of markers of kidney function, and they concluded that high protein diets do not cause kidney disease, and the small and not even that consistent increased filtration rates are in almost all cases still within the normal range. And they reflect just a simple physiological, regulatory, but not pathogenic or pathophysiological response to higher protein loads. So essentially what they're saying, and this has been repeated by a systematic review by Cheng and colleagues with almost 150,000 people looking at epidemiological observations, is saying, hey, you know what? We're seeing inverse associations between high protein intakes and kidney disease or markers of kidney function in humans. So what's going on here? Because we are seeing increase in glomerular filtration rates. So the idea here is that as a modest a modest increase in protein intake actually results in a functional improvement in your kidney's ability. It's adapting, right? It's just like your heart when you're doing exercise, So it improves its ability to filter effectively, and it's not overloading it to the point where it can't adapt to it, right? It's a functional and positive adaptation. Now, I can't sit here and tell you, hey, look at all this observational data, therefore we can disprove this one out of one side of my mouth just based upon my biases. The strongest piece of evidence which shifts this from being implausible to fully disproven is something where you can actually determine causation. And this is something I think, I don't know that we've talked about Mendelian randomization before on Iron Culture. Do you think we have, Trex? No?
No.
Okay. Cool. Well, there's a great study in 2021 by Park and colleagues where what they did was they used a genetic variant, so a gene, that specifically influences the amount of macronutrients you eat. So people who have this, either this gene or don't have this gene, tend to have higher or lower fat and protein intakes. And they were able to look at the relationship between macronutrient intake with effectively the randomizer being that, okay, is that due to some behavior or is it due to the presence of the gene? So Mendelian randomization is essentially a way, if you make sure, this is important, that the specific gene does not have other relationships with behavior, lifestyle, or disease occurrence of any of the other variables you're looking at. It doesn't co-vary with any of the outcomes or moderators that you're interested in. It can be used as a natural experiment. It embeds randomization into the observation, so it makes the potential of confounding factors, reverse causation, or bias being introduced greatly reduced. And I think it is it's accurate if those if those specific delimiters are in place and you have made sure that there's no covariates that aren't controlled for, or you're not influencing something else that could influence the outcome, to say this is a method of observing causation. And Park and colleagues specifically found that high protein diets were actually associated with better outcomes for kidney disease. And it was, if anything, higher fat intakes were causally related to increasing the risk of developing kidney disease. So they saw higher protein, decreased risk, higher fat intake, increased risk. So this one is another one where we can put it firmly in the column of this is not a thing. Yes, we see increased glomerular filtration rates when you increase your protein intake, but in healthy people, that is actually a functional positive adaptation. Your kidneys are getting better at filtering, and it's actually protective against developing CKD or chronic kidney disease. And I do want to just emphasize this though, because sometimes we get just too caught up in the world of everyone is healthy and there's no one who's like has clinical issues. There are actual experimental data showing that when you get higher glomerular filtration rates in people with kidney disease, it's not a good thing. That is actually an indication across a milieu of negative signs, and more importantly, that protein restriction in people with existing kidney disease can actually slow the progression of chronic kidney disease, at least in the early and moderate stages. It's not a huge effect, but it is a small benefit that they see, so a small effect size. So it is still valid in someone actually with CKD to go, you know what, we want to pull back on protein, even though in healthy people, a higher protein diet typically is associated with better outcomes, so long as fat intake is controlled and you're doing other things in a healthy manner.
Good stuff. Yeah, you want to quickly hit the high notes of the type 2 diabetes claim, and then we can get into the broader conversation about the controversies on social media.
Yeah, and this one is easy to hit the highlights on because this is actually the one that fell in that category of, you know what, technically we need more research. Now I'll tell you, my personal interpretation of this is I'd be very surprised if anyone was able to create a link causally and independently with protein and risk of type 2 diabetes or any type of metabolic disease. But what we have essentially are a mixture of observational data, a heavily confounded set of observational data. I'm not aware of Mendelian randomization. I'm not aware of really well-controlled meta-science on this that has observations to the opposite. But essentially what we see is that in some cases, there are relationships between diabetes and protein intake. And that could just be because people who eat more calories, and especially people who eat more Western processed diets, more fried foods, also tend to increase, higher protein intakes. Like if you went out and ate a whole bunch of like burnt meat, you're probably going to get cancer more often, but you're also going to have a higher protein diet. And what other behaviors do people who eat tremendous amounts of heavily charred barbecue have? Like they probably live somewhere in the South. They might be drinking sweet tea. They may not be very active. They could live in a food desert. And you can technically control, quote unquote, I know you hate that terminology, Trex, for all those covariates, but the reality is that statistical adjustments are just that. We're not truly then, oh, we've made this an RCT. That's not what's happening, right? Yeah. When we look at I know we think, like, okay, if I'm looking at a study of 6 months of manipulating red meat intake, how is that different besides the time course of looking at an observational study over 6 years of people with higher or lower red meat? And I control for things like smoking and obesity and activity. They're pretty damn different because the former, what you're really doing is you're looking at food substitution as an intervention. Because when you give someone experimentally a food, it will displace something else in their diet. That's just the way that works. But when you observe people, you're observing overall dietary patterns. You might be focused on red meat consumption, but you are not aware of, or you have not necessarily taken account for everything else that happens to occur in people with that dietary pattern. So there are bidirectional relationships here, because some data, like I said, protein seems to contribute to the risk for type 2 diabetes, but other data says actually that's not the case. And we see, plant, dairy, egg proteins either having neutral or positive effects. And there's even one analysis of markers, not actual incidence of diabetes, where red meat was experimentally shown to have some small reductions in postprandial glucose for people, which would be, an acute marker that would indicate you're less likely to get type 2 diabetes. So anyway, that's all we really have. And then there's also potential mechanistic arguments of why downstream mTOR activation could result in, insulin signaling that could lead to something. So it's a really messy area, and we basically just don't have firm data to truly just go, no, this is not a thing.
Yeah.
Except, and here's why I'm very skeptical of it. when we look at interventions in people with metabolic disease and experimentally going, you know what, let's try to put you on a high protein diet that's also healthy, that's generally associated with better outcomes, better appetite control, which is not just the protein, it's a lot of things, and reductions in visceral adiposity, reductions in blood glucose levels, triglycerides, and everything that you'd want to see, as well as importantly, just overall fat loss and being in a caloric deficit. And it's hard for me to square that circle where we know that counseling people to increase lean protein sources and improve their diet is a huge net positive and one of the best tools in our belt, but actually the protein's causing an issue.
Yeah.
So to me, that says maybe at worst, high protein diets in the presence of other things cause issues, but more likely, the clustering of behaviors that lead someone to develop type 2 diabetes often includes, in the data sets we have and in the populations we look at, high protein intakes as well.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, I totally agree. This is one of the areas where I will rarely call a mechanistic shot and say, empirically, I know we got a ways to go, but I actually have a strong hunch on this one. I am of the belief, based on some mechanisms that have been reasonably well established, I think we have a scenario where developing type 2 diabetes alters your metabolism of branched chain amino acids. I think a lot of folks that make this link, a lot of times they look at, well, how do you explain these high, circulating branched chain amino acid levels that seem to correlate really well with all these different, type 2 diabetes and the various morbidity and mortality outcomes. I think what we're really looking at here is in the observational stuff, people who eat more calories eat more protein. And I think what we're looking at in the mechanistic stuff is that diabetes alters branched chain amino acid metabolism, not branched chain amino acid intake gives you diabetes. So I feel pretty confident about those two things. But like you said, if the goal of the review paper is to be purely objective and not forecast in the future, but just say, what do we have currently? I do agree with the assessment of the authors while also having a very strong prospective hunch about where this work's going.
No, I would totally agree with you. And I think if this paper is written again in 10 years, I would suspect we would have this one shifted into the implausible category, if I had to guess.
Yeah. All right, Helms.
So Trex, people hate you on the internet.
They do. Yeah.
They do. We had the good folks at the Sports Nutrition Association making collaborative posts with us at Mass, trying to get the word out, doing more education for people interested in understanding nutrition. And you foolhardily wrote an article based upon epidemiology of all things. And I've heard there was actually a funder of this epidemiology paper, which means it's suspect and probably part of the food conglomerates which want us all dying from seed oil consumption.
Correct.
That's what I took.
Yeah. Yeah. So in my defense, I did not write this article thinking, oh my God, this is going to make the best Instagram post. As you know, our dear friends at the Sports Nutrition Association, they read Mass, as all good people do. And, they'll say, hey, we like this article. We want to make a little post about it. And, we'll do kind of a collaborative post. I have to be honest. I knew that this article was going to be somewhat controversial. It was an article about 2 new studies, which is rare for a Mass article, which made the communication even more fractured on the Instagram thread. But it was about the 2 new studies, one of which was looking at the comparative effects of plant-based oils, including seed oils in the diet versus saturated fat in the diet, looking at a variety of mortality-related outcomes. The other paper was the now infamous observational study where they had a bunch of quote-unquote lean mass hyper-responders who had a history of being on ketogenic diets. They observed their plaque progression over a 1-year period. They found rapid plaque progression and then interpreted the study as if they did not find rapid plaque progression. So both of those things get lumped together in this article because they are they kind of fall into this umbrella of the kind of what I call, not to be disparaging, but I think it is objectively true, uh, the kind of nutrition science contrarians of today, who basically have, and not all people fall in line with every element of this kind of overarching theory, but you can broadly, paint with a broad brush and summarize it as follows. All that crap from 1950 to 1990 that everyone was saying in the nutrition world, all that research about saturated fat, LDL cholesterol, ApoB, heart disease, that stuff's all nonsense. What's really killing you is really two things. The American diet has too much carbohydrate, and the American diet has too much seed oil. And so if we ditch the carbohydrate, ditch the seed oils, and got back to the good stuff, which is a lot of meat and a lot of saturated fatty acids, we'd all be better for it. Now, I call it contrarianism because it does really ask you to look past a lot of very robust, very rigorous, very established science. That's not to say that we've fully cracked the code on what the optimal human diet is, but many of the claims that are put forward by this camp are really unfounded and directly contradictory of a lot of the evidence. And
causal evidence, I'll point out.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Causal evidence. And so basically, my article went over the findings of the paper, the two papers, which were basically, it's not a good idea to have LDL consistently at triple the upper limit that's recommended. If your doctor says I'd like your LDL below 100, don't keep it at 300 for 2 decades. That's not a controversial thing to say. And the paper basically found that in people who literally were in that up, 200, 250, 300 for their LDL levels, they rapidly were accruing plaque in their arteries, which is a crash course for cardiac events later in life. So that was the one kind of set of claims, was basically the things we know, we actually do know, and you do not want to have sky-high LDL and ApoB levels. And if you do have sky-high ApoB and LDL levels, you want to reduce them. And how do you do that? Well, you probably don't eat a super high-fat, animal-based ketogenic diet. You probably shift to a more plant-oriented dietary pattern. Doesn't mean you have to go vegan, but you probably incorporate more high-fiber plant foods. You probably go to leaner protein sources. You probably get your total fat and certainly your saturated fat down a little bit. And so that ruffled some feathers. And then the other paper basically modeled out the different mortality.
And this is where people actually lost their mind, which is wild to me. Like the out of the two papers, one being this complete comedy of errors, still hitting branches while it's falling, internal debates between the authors, massive conflicts of interest.
Public internal debates, yeah.
Yes, that's true. Public debates between authors is what I should say, rather than internal. Conflicts of interest stemming from not only vested interest in the ketogenic diet itself, but also the imaging software used to see the accumulation of plaque that now we're going, oh, that must be terrible because this can't be true. Between authors on this paper, again, people saying, I didn't approve this. I'm just curious how long it's going to take for this thing to get retracted. That's the debate. That's what we should be betting on. That one, no one said anything about it, but they were like, hold on, are you citing epidemiology, Trex?
Yeah.
Epidemiology?
Yeah.
And that whole field, don't you know it's pseudoscience?
And honestly, like prospective cohort studies as well, which are like kind of pretty good as far as epidemiology goes. I mean, there's varying degrees of robustness, but it's not like they just went out and said, here's a few surveys. What have you been eating your whole life? You know what I mean? Like this is where they actually recruit cohorts. They have follow up. They actually track their behaviors over time with repeated surveys and check-ins. But basically,
so Trex, actually, let's take a second, because I think most people, they hear epidemiology, they hear observational, and that gets lumped into one spot one tier on the evidence pyramid. And there's various versions of the evidence pyramid out there, but I think it's worth talking about the difference between a cross-sectional analysis versus a prospective cohort study in a little more depth. People actually know why that's potentially more useful.
Yeah. So epidemiology, as we've kind of like hinted at in a few different ways, I should just say observational studies can take a lot of different forms. Now, of course, everybody wants the giant, super long randomized controlled trial for everything. But that's not reality. Sometimes resources are not permissible for that. Sometimes it's not ethical. Sometimes the timelines are simply not feasible. So sometimes we do have to really lean on observational evidence to get at questions that we can't really test in a randomized controlled trial with any level of affordability or feasibility. But observational trials can take many forms. So, for example, that keto CTA trial that we were just talking about was an observational trial, right? They basically said, hey, you meet the criteria. We just want to watch for a year and see how much plaque accumulates in your arteries. But people, I guess, give that the benefit of the doubt because it's smaller. And usually when you look at a study, you don't say, as long as the sample size is small, then I'll feel good about it. But in this case, I think people feel more comfortable about the more nuanced measurements that are available in a smaller observational trial. I think people intuitively feel like you can extract better nutrition information from people in a smaller cohort purely based on its size. I don't find that to be true at all. And generally speaking, people are using the same diet logging tools or diet recall tools, whether they have 100 participants or 3,000 participants. All that is to say, you can have a small group that you're following based on habits they report. You could recruit a big old group of people and say, I want to follow you for the next 15 years and do check-ins. And so that would be a prospective study where you kind of have this established ongoing, repeated serial measurement protocol where it tends to give you some really nice observations of these longitudinal trajectories, which goes a little bit, it goes a longer way than trying to say, I just want to survey a bunch of 50-year-olds and say, how are you eating today? And I'm just going to assume you've been doing that for 50 years of your life, right? So what you can do is actually establish this longitudinal track record of what behaviors this person actually engages in. You can see how they change over time. You can also do case control studies where you say, we're going to find, a big group of people who developed type 2 diabetes and a big group of similar people who didn't, and try to work backward looking at their habits and figure out how some people go left, some people go right. So there's a lot of different ways. We can do Mendelian randomization where you say, I'm not just going to rely on what you list your behaviors to be. I want to look at a particular genetic variant that tells me a lot about how your trajectory is going to go as it pertains to this one variable. So, for example, there's been Mendelian randomization studies where they look at alcohol intake, and they basically say, I know that this genetic variant basically sets you up with a much higher likelihood that you're going to overconsume alcohol in your adulthood. And this particular variant doesn't really seem to dictate anything else. So it gives us this kind of true experiment that still has its imperfections, right? Because not every person's entire life trajectory is dictated by their genetic code. There are going to be some people who have that genetic variant and do not engage in a lot of drinking. But all that is to say, there's all these different tools, and if you go into a conversation and you actually want the answer, like you're actually interested in the truth, then what you would say is, for almost all research questions, the perfect evidence does not yet exist and may never exist. But let's use what we've got, interpret those things within the context of their shortcomings, and see if we're getting a constellation of findings across different types of research that's basically given us a picture, right? So when you look up in the stars and you say, I've been told that that's supposed to be a lion in that constellation. I'm not so sure if I'm sold on that, but it's not a hot air balloon, right? I'm at least in the ballpark. I get what you're getting at up there. So that usually is the goal if you're not married to a theory and you're willing to go down with the ship. And so Helms, the other paper I covered in this article that became a social media post was basically modeling out using a few cohorts of these kind of really big cohorts in most, if not all of them, were prospective studies. So nurses health study 1 and 2, health professionals follow-up study. So these really big cohorts that they're following for multiple years, long follow-up times. And so basically they were looking at a variety of different mortality-related outcomes in this study across these groups. And they're trying to figure out, based on the dietary habits of these people, do we see an increase in total mortality or cancer mortality or cardiovascular disease mortality when you're consuming, butter versus olive oil versus soybean oil, a bunch of different oil types. And then they did kind of break it down into butter versus just any plant oil. And so what was cool about this, what was really nice, and this is really ironic, Helms, is that they didn't just say this oil was associated with increased risk and that one was associated with decreased risk. A lot of times observational studies leave it there and say, do with that what you will. But they actually took the very pragmatic approach of saying, you know what, I'm going to venture to say that if you reduce the intake of one fat source, you're still probably going to need to get that pan lubricated before you cook. So let's go ahead and assume that you put something else in there instead, right? And I think that's, in my opinion, a really awesome thing for observational studies to do is to actually model out replacements. Because in reality, when you say, okay, I'm going to remove a thing from my diet, you are probably, in the vast majority of cases, going to replace it with something else. And the question is, if we can predict what that probably will be, why don't we model that out and see what that would look like? And what's really ironic about it is that someone in the thread criticized it they're like, well, that's a false dichotomy. You don't have to choose between butter or a plant oil. You could just have less butter. And it's like, well, you already have that effect estimate cooked in here. If we want to isolate the effect of butter compared to just anything else, we have that. But this study takes it a step further and actually answers the more practical question which is that I decided I'm not going to have as much butter, but I'm about to cook eggs and I don't want them to stick to the pan. So what if I use something else? So what's really interesting about the way that thread unfolded is a lot of people just said, like, full stop. You are acknowledging that epidemiology exists. You're an idiot. Like, if you believe you
Where
can...
did you find your PhD? That was one good comment.
Yeah, and luckily that was directed at you, not me, even though I wrote the article. So good to disparage you and your institutions rather than mine. But
correct. From the highly objective poster, I believe, like the carnivore bodybuilder or the original carnivore bodybuilder. Yeah. That one so, I probably didn't feel like engaging with.
Yeah, it is true. So that's kind of what I was getting at. But it was telling that a lot of people who came in really hard saying this is stupid literally put their dietary biases in the handle of their Instagram. And so right away, like, I am not in a random Instagram thread going to convince someone who has like keto or carnivore or butter, in their handle. They're not going to have one random interaction on the internet and be like, you know what, maybe I was wrong about everything now that I think about it, right? So I did try to engage in the thread where I could in places where it felt constructive and kind of, provide some food for thought, so to speak. But definitely there were a lot of people who just outright said nutritional epidemiology is stupid and fatally flawed. And it's not just that I don't accept the findings of this paper. It's that I think you are stupid for even bothering to take a peek at it. Now, in the article, I cite randomized controlled trials that are fully in line with the types of findings that we're seeing here, but I can't say that they are, I can say they're in line with the general premise, but I can't say they found the exact same thing. And that's the biggest point, Helms, is if you're in a room with a bunch of people smarter than you and they're looking at the papers that you think are useless, you may very well be wrong. You may not get why they're looking at those papers. And the reality is, there are a lot of people who think smoking increases your risk of lung cancer, but not because of a human randomized controlled trial. To the best of my knowledge, that doesn't exist. The more extreme example is most people, when they skydive, bring a parachute just in case. But we don't have that randomized controlled trial either in humans. There are some questions that either, let's say we're talking about a pathology or a condition that develops over a 25-year time span. You're not getting that in an RCT in humans. You could try to do it in a rodent model that has, much shorter lifespan and try to play that out. But then people are going to say, that's a mouse, idiot. And they're right. It is a mouse. I'd honestly rather look at some of these, a combination of these different types of observational evidence where we actually can say, hey, what'd you live like for the last 70 years? And how'd that turn out for you? So there are some things that are just prohibitive in terms of the timeline of progression and development that we can't really do a randomized controlled trial and walk away with really strong conclusions. There are also things that are simply too unethical. And so if you want randomized controlled trials that look at mortality as the outcome, that means somebody submitted an IRB where they said, I believe I'm going to kill half these suckers. And generally speaking, IRBs don't like that. So it was a thread that definitely tested my patience a little bit. And I think my patience succeeded with flying colors.
I would agree.
Yeah, I was I didn't beat around the bush, but I think I was very kind and diplomatic, probably kinder than was warranted. And frankly just said, hey, listen, folks, one thing you won't find in the Instagram post is me saying, this is the perfect paper. Wrap it up. No, we don't need anything else. This is it. If I find one epidemiological paper that supports my bias, I'm done. I'm good. But unfortunately, that was the way a lot of people took it. And,
Yep.
To me, honestly, and this was a Mass article, I'm just going to heap praise on the Mass audience. Frankly, sometimes I find in my writing lately, I respect them too much to necessarily point out the painfully obvious stuff, which is, every time I write about a nutritional epidemiology paper, am I going to say, by the way, did you know that the average person can't say with 100% certainty how many grams of butter they have on a daily basis? I thought we all knew that. You know what I mean, Helms?
Yep.
So when you interpret any paper, you're going to interpret it within the context of its findings. The same way that, Helms, every time you write a paper about this nonsense of, long muscle lengths, blah, 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 nobody cares. Being facetious, playing into my character and how much I hate the long muscle length stuff. You don't, at the end of every article, say, by the way, this was an 8-week training program, and if you plan to train for more than 8 weeks in your life, you may want to think about how this will actually extrapolate into the long term, right? You don't necessarily say that every single time because, of course, right? Probably don't need to paint that whole picture every time. But all that is to say, I think it's a good example of, when people get really married to an idea or a theory, sometimes it seems as if they are hiding from the best possible assessment of the evidence rather than seeking it out. And so you'll say, well, okay, I've got this observational study that really doesn't support what you're saying at all. And they're like, nutritional epidemiology is crap. I said, okay, but it actually supports or is completely compatible with the findings of these 3 randomized controlled trials. And they say, well, I don't like the way they designed that, or it was too short, or why didn't they measure inflammation? But every piece of evidence you throw at them that isn't basically ex vivo, a tissue in a petri dish, or a mouse, it's like all other findings are fatally flawed and not even worth reading. but of course my body's going to respond the same way a mouse does. I'm certain of it. And not just any mouse, a mouse that is genetically bred to have very distinct characteristics that make it fundamentally different from all other mice. So, yeah, it was one of those threads where you have to kind of accept going into it. There's going to be people who are enthusiastically hiding from an assessment of the evidence that we currently have. And it's intriguing to see the way they throw certain forms of evidence under the bus without actually applying that same level of critical thinking to the sources that ultimately support their line of thinking. But Helms, if I can say one last thing here, this is, in my opinion, the most important point. No, I don't want to say no one. Very few people are going out there and saying, basically painting a picture of an actual effect estimate, saying seed oils are bad. They are doing this thing, which is causing a very, very, very modest negative effect that will only be perceptible. We can only separate that signal from the noise if you analyze your data in the following way. No one is giving that prescriptive approach. What they're telling you is seed oils are a catastrophe, an abomination that the American population has been subject to for decades, and it is literally killing you. However, the effect doesn't show up in any of the long-term studies. So it's like you can't give me the fire and brimstone, this is the most toxic thing you encounter on a daily basis, and then I say, show me anyone who's suffering any kind of ill effects when we actually look at these outcome-focused studies, and they say, well, that stuff's all trash anyway. Well, it's the same stuff we used to figure out that cigarettes were bad. And that stuff was pretty clear. The effect estimates, Helms, were not small. They were very, very large. And even though we didn't know the exact number of cigarettes per day people smoked, we could kind of discern 3 packs a day, 1 pack a day, none. Smoke for 20 years, smoke for 0 years. We could sort it out. And so when you use this overly bombastic, completely hyperbolic language about the negative health effects of this thing, at a certain point it has to show up in some kind of data that involves a human being. And especially when it comes to the seed oil thing, that's just not the case.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think if I could help wrap a practical bow on this for people trying to discern who is trustworthy and also to know how to use data when they come across it. Someone is, I'm not going to say they're not trustworthy. It may not be. This isn't a value statement. They're more likely to lead you astray because of this limitation of their knowledge or this way of approaching things philosophically. If the informative piece of the limitations of a given type of research are reject or use, you're in a bad spot. If they are looking at limitations instead to go, what can we know and what can we not know with confidence? And what can this tell us? What are the limits? Because a limitation is not a decision to reject. It's to understand the limits, quite literally. That's the word of what it can mean. It's something I've said forever about observational research and anecdotal data, is that it tells you what was insufficient to prevent the outcome. And I use this a lot of the times in the bodybuilding world. We can look at all the Mr. Olympias out there, and we can say everything they didn't stop them from becoming a Mr. Olympia. Yeah. Some things were neutral, some things were mildly negative, and a lot of things were probably positive. Frankly, their parents,
yeah.
Yeah. Yes, right? But none of the decisions they made in the gym, the kitchen, or in their lifestyle was so bad that it actually prevented them from being Mr. Olympia. So at the very least, when we're looking at observational data, it's the same story. If the consumption of seed oils is as bad as it's being claimed, well, how does that square with observational data where we don't see these catastrophic negative relationships? Does that mean everything else in their lives is so positive that it's offsetting that? And then how much does that stretch the credulity, to stretch the limitation, or stretch the imagination for that to be true? And then now we have to understand, okay, Okay, that's the limitation of observational research. Let's take a look at what's the almost fundamental limitation of controlled trials, because you're trading limitations. When we're talking about mortality, death, we're not going to be observing death for the reasons you stated before. I'm not going to rehash that, both the length of time and the ethics. And that also typically means that we can't observe the actual occurrence of a disease state or anything unethical for the time length and also the ethics involved. So that means we're always going to be looking at markers, not outcomes. We're going to be looking at blood pressure, cholesterol. We're going to be looking at self-reported scores. We're going to be looking at blood glucose, HbA1c, whatever, right? And those are markers for health, and they're subject to the same limitations as I talked about with calcium excretion, as well as, for example, higher glomerular filtration rates. And we saw the issue there. A higher glomerular filtration rate is not chronic kidney disease. It might even be protective, right? So we're either going to be looking at, maybe for a couple years, best case scenario, highly funded, extremely expensive study, a marker for health, but not the actual outcome. And now we're doing an RCT, but not on the thing you actually are making a claim about. So now, for example, we'll do a parallel with bodybuilding research. Now we've got this really well-funded study, but we're only looking at MPS. And it's only for 3 days, right? Or we can look at 8 weeks and we can look at hypertrophy, right? Or we can look at, okay, what do these Mr. Olympias do? But unfortunately, in the nutrition world, we don't get that middle one. We can't look at actual hypertrophy over a reasonable time period that then we have to extrapolate to longer time periods. All we got are the two ends. You can either look at the actual thing you care about, but have it be confounded by it's occurring in a cluster of behaviors, or we can look at a thing that might in some cases potentially lead to it, but only for a short period of time. So now what we can do is, instead of rejecting one or the other based upon whatever decision you make of rejecting something based upon its limitations, you look at the limits of one and the limits of the other, and you realize, in fact, they're complementary. So we're not throwing them out, we're looking at both, and we're figuring out, if this were true, how would these two things play out? So we can start with saying, hey, clearly this can only be causing a sufficient level of harm to not be showing up when we look at it observationally. Okay, well, let's look at the markers. If this was killing us in X, Y, or Z way, which markers would go up if we consume more of this in a controlled manner? And the controlled data don't show that either. Sorry. So then you're left with someone who is either going to reject the mechanism and say, no, lean mass hyperresponders, or I don't believe in LDL. It's something about this specific classification of it, or ApoB, ApoA, or whatever. Or I need to throw out all of science, or I need to point out the funding source, or I need to point out there's some type of nefarious data analyst, or the methods need to be thrown out. So there's a playbook, you know?
Yeah, it's a playbook, and usually, Helms, what you find, especially in this conversation, is that the secret page that underlies the entire playbook is insisting, you mentioned previously, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? And basically what that means is, just because a thing hasn't been very, very deliberately and directly shown, doesn't mean that it is simply not a thing that happens. It doesn't mean like, well, that couldn't possibly be true, right? So a lot of times what you find is like that last page of the playbook that undergirds everything in it is, I am going to construct a metabolic and physiological scenario that has never actually been put to the test in research. And I'm going to suggest that only when you unlock that do you find the real optimal human health, and that everyone in these observational studies, everyone in the RCTs is so metabolically unwell that none of my theories are getting the opportunity to shine. And that's ultimately and you can't really think of a better, more on-the-nose description than lean mass hyperresponders, right? It's like, okay, so
it's the optimal diet in the cracks.
Yeah, you prove to me that if a person is lean, has wildly high LDL, has high HDL, has extremely low triglycerides, you show me several forms of robust evidence suggesting that person is going to suffer ill health from their LDL, being triple the level it's supposed to be. And they're going to say, if you can't show me that, then you have no grounds to suggest that just because their LDL is 350, that they might want to take care of that and kind of get it lower. And you could easily just go right back at them and say, you prove to me that the link between ApoB and heart disease holds in people who are left-handed, in people with red hair, and especially, obviously, as we all know, people who are left-handed with red hair, that relationship completely breaks down. Prove me wrong.
Yep.
And that's essentially the whole playbook here is I am going to work my narrative increasingly into an area where evidence is irrelevant. There's no such thing as evidence in the playground that I play in. So therefore, you give me epidemiology, I say that's crap. You give me an RCT, I say all those people are fat and sick anyway. And you are hiding from evidence rather than, like you said, Helms, trying to triangulate all these different forms of evidence with the limitations they have and work your way towards something that feels like a pretty blurry but not meaningless picture of what's really going on here.
Yep. If someone just says correlation is not causation, epidemiology is crap, healthy user bias, and funding, and they manage to work all of those into a single post, and their name is not the carnivore blank, it might as well be in many cases.
Yeah. And that's the other thing that I haven't addressed is the healthy user bias one. It's like a lot of times that's like the first thing that comes out when you look at some of these observational trials. And the idea there is that essentially, surely anyone who gives a crap about their health is already avoiding, I guess in this case, seed oils? Or no, they're eating more seed oils. Yeah, so the healthy user bias would be people who are
all the things they're doing.
Yeah.
So it's healthy people who happen to be eating seed oils, and their activity levels, their body fat, all the other things they do that are positive have fully offset the disastrous effect that apparently it's not that disastrous of seed oils.
Exactly. So you take your average
We've already basically addressed it,
yeah,
to be honest.
But you take your average nurse and you assume that everything else that they're doing is so healthy that these toxic seed oils couldn't possibly catch up with them. It's just a really nonsensical thing. So, Helms, lest we feed a fed horse here, which is the new and improved slogan there.
Beat a dead horse, yeah. Gotcha.
Lest we do that, any closing words that you want to wrap up with, or should we get out of here?
No, I would just say, hey, if you want to know what the heck are we talking about, check out the recent post we have in collaboration on the Instagram for Mass with the Sports Nutrition Association. And you know what? I'll ask on his behalf. Dr. Trex has been wading into those waters. He's tried to demonstrate how to handle with grace, professionalism, and an unbiased approach to the evidence some of these claims. But if you want to get in there, and please be polite. I know I'm calling for people to help you out, but please do it respectfully. Please know that I'm not asking you to just get into a flame war with these folks. But if you want to point out some of the things we've talked about, we're not going to stop you if you do so politely. And just keep it respectful, keep it classy, folks, and help us.
Yeah. It's the reason I recoiled is because, Helms, you know as well as anybody, there's one of two ways that these threads can turn around. One is that somehow you summon the army that does, fights the good fight and lays down some good science in there. The other one is that it simply dies and goes away, lost to time. And I feel like it's at a lull where I may be saved by just the short attention span.
You want the latter.
Yeah, the short attention span of the internet was just about to bail me out of having to deal with more of it. But hey, if people want to get in there, that is their right and their prerogative.
Just like that, they pulled me back in.
Yeah. All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us on this lovely Monday night. Like I said, if you want to support the show, many ways to do it. I'm not going to rehash them, but you know what to do. At the very least, give the video a like, subscribe, all that other stuff. We really appreciate it. Sorry we couldn't get to any live chat questions today, but we'll be doing it in the future. We appreciate you. Take care. Have a great week. And we will be back in 7 days.